"Sir, is that a museum piece?" The question, laced with the easy arrogance of youth, cut through the tense quiet of the firing line. Corporal Davies, barely 20, with a chiseled jaw and a rifle that looked like it was designed in a science fiction film, nodded toward the old man's weapon. Lester Newton, 84 years old, didn't turn. His hands, weathered and mapped with the fine lines of a long life, remained steady on the worn wooden stock of his rifle. He lay in the prone position on his canvas mat, his body still, his breathing measured. The only thing that moved was his one open eye, scanning the 1,000 yards of heat-shimmering air to a target that was little more than a speck. Davies smirked at his squad mates, who chuckled behind their hands. "License and registration on that thing, Grandpa," another one whispered, just loud enough to carry. "Better check if it's coded as a historical artifact." Their own rifles were marvels of modern engineering, black polymer covered in rails and attachments, with scopes the size of small telescopes. Lester's rifle was a relic of wood and blued steel, and the scope was the real joke. It was slender, with brass fittings and visible scratches on its housing. Compared to their high-powered optics, it looked like a toy. The mockery, which had started as murmurs when Lester first uncased his weapon, now grew bolder. They were a pack, young and strong, clad in the crisp digital camouflage of the modern Marine Corps. They saw an old man who seemed lost, a relic who had wandered into their high-stakes world of precision shooting. This was the all-Marine rifle competition, a showcase of the best marksmen in the Corps. To them, Lester was an embarrassment, a harmless but pathetic piece of living history that was holding up the line. "Look at the finish on that stock," Davies said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Bet he used it to paddle a canoe back in the day." "That scope's probably got more dust inside than glass," his friend, a private named Miller, added. "Can he even see the target from here? The range officer should check his eyesight, not his rifle." The comments were like stones skipped across a calm pond, each one making a wider ripple. Other competitors, younger men and women in their prime, began to notice. They saw the cluster of laughing Marines and the old man they were targeting. A few looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Davies was a known hotshot, a top shooter from his unit, and his confidence was infectious. The crowd's silent consensus seemed to be that the old man was out of his place. Feeling empowered by the audience, Davies decided to escalate. This wasn't just fun anymore, it was about standards. This old-timer and his ancient gear were a potential safety hazard. He stood up and strode over to the range safety officer, a gunnery sergeant with a face like granite and the patience of a ticking clock. "Gunny, I've got a concern," Davies said, projecting his voice for effect. He pointed back at Lester. "That competitor's equipment. It doesn't look regulation. Frankly, it doesn't look safe. I'm worried about a misfire, or worse." The entire firing line went quiet. A direct challenge to another competitor's gear was a serious move. The gunnery sergeant's eyes narrowed. He was bound by protocol to investigate any safety concern. With a heavy sigh, he walked down the line, his boots crunching on the gravel, every step echoing in the sudden silence. He stopped beside Lester's mat. "Sir," the gunny said, his voice professional but firm, "I've received a complaint about your weapon system. I need to inspect it." Lester slowly, deliberately, pushed himself up to a sitting position. He didn't look angry or embarrassed. He simply looked tired, as if this was an interruption he had weathered 1,000 times before. He picked up the rifle and handed it to the gunnery sergeant. The gunny took the weapon. He worked the bolt. It moved with a smoothness that only comes from decades of meticulous care. He checked the chamber, the barrel, the trigger assembly. It was old, yes. The bluing was worn to a silver sheen in places, and the wood was dark with age and oil, but it was flawlessly maintained. He then examined the scope, squinting at the old glass. "She's sighted in, Gunny," Lester said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "She'll do the job." The gunnery sergeant could find no legitimate safety violation. The rifle was sound, but the pressure from Davies and the expectant eyes of the other Marines weighed on him. "The rifle checks out," he announced to the line, "but it is a non-standard piece of equipment. Sir, you can proceed, but be advised, any operational failure, any issue at all, and you will be immediately disqualified from the competition." He handed the rifle back. As Lester took it, his thumb brushed over a deep, jagged scratch in the metal housing of the scope, just beside the windage adjustment knob. For a fraction of a second, the bright, sun-drenched range dissolved. The smell of fresh-cut grass and gunpowder was replaced by the thick, metallic scent of blood and jungle rot. The pop-pop-pop of distant rifles became the deafening roar of automatic fire and the gut-wrenching whine of incoming rounds. He was 20 years old again, his cheek pressed against this same stock, his knuckles white as he gripped this same rifle. The scratch wasn't there yet, A voice, young and full of life, shouted over the chaos. It was his spotter, Miguel. "Keep her steady, Les, make it count." The memory vanished as quickly as it came, a flash of lightning in his mind, but it left a stillness in its wake, a cold, hard focus that burned away the noise of the laughing Marines and the gunny's warning. The scratch wasn't damage, it was a scar, a reminder. He settled back into his prone position, the familiar weight of the rifle a comfort. The humiliation was a physical presence now, a heavy blanket over the entire range. The young Marines were no longer whispering. They were openly making bets, their voices confident. $10 said he wouldn't even hit the paper. 20 said the old scope would fall off after the first shot. Davies, feeling vindicated, just shook his head with a theatrical pity. In the small set of bleachers behind the firing line, a man sat watching. He was older than the gunny but younger than Lester, with a ramrod-straight posture that even civilian clothes couldn't hide. This was Elias Vance, a retired master gunnery sergeant, and a legend in the competitive shooting world. He hadn't come to watch the hotshots like Davies. He had come because he'd heard a rumor that an old name from the history books was going to be on the line today. He had watched the entire scene unfold, a knot of disgust tightening in his stomach. He saw the polished arrogance of the young Marines, and he saw the quiet, unbreakable dignity of Lester Newton. He recognized the rifle model, a customized bolt action from an era long past. But more than that, he recognized the look in Lester's eyes. It was the look of a man for whom the rifle was not a tool for sport, but an extension of his will. Vance had seen enough. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving across the screen with purpose. He didn't call security or the range master. He had a different number in his contacts. He sent a text message to a man he had served with 20 years ago, a man who was now Colonel Miller, the base's chief of staff. The message was short and direct. "Colonel, get down to range 7, now. There's a living legend on the line being treated like a fool by your new recruits. His name is Lester Newton. You need to handle this personally." Vance put the phone away. His face was grim. He knew the name Lester Newton would be like a bomb going off in the command building. He settled back to watch. He knew the shot hadn't been fired yet, but the battle for range 7 was already over. The cavalry was on its way. Inside the climate-controlled quiet of the base command center, Colonel Miller glanced at his phone, his brow furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. The all-Marine competition was running smoothly, and he was busy coordinating with the VIPs in attendance. But the text was from Elias Vance, and Vance wasn't one for drama. He read the message twice. "Lester Newton," he mumbled to himself. The name was familiar, a whisper from the deep history of the Corps, but he couldn't place it. He turned to his aide, a sharp-eyed captain standing nearby. "Captain, do me a favor. Run the name Lester Newton through the service records database. Cross-reference with today's competitor roster for the rifle competition." "Aye, sir," the captain said, turning to his terminal. He typed in the name. For a moment he stared at the screen, his fingers frozen over the keyboard. Then his eyes widened. He shot to his feet so fast his chair screeched back and nearly tipped over. "Sir," he said, his voice an urgent, strangled whisper. "You need to see this." Colonel Miller walked over, an impatient look on his face. He looked at the screen, and the blood drained from his face. It wasn't a standard service record. It was a ghost file, a heavily redacted document that was more black ink than text. There was a single grainy photo from the 1960s, showing a young man with old eyes and a face as hard as iron. The file listed decorations that were the stuff of Marine Corps mythology. A Navy Cross, then another, and then at the top a citation for the Medal of Honor, the details of which were classified at a level the colonel himself couldn't access. Beneath it, a single cryptic entry. Project Hawkeye, lead marksman, efficacy rating, 100%. Miller felt a chill creep up his spine. Project Hawkeye was a Black Ops program from Vietnam, a sniper initiative so secret it was officially denied to have ever existed, and this man was its lead operator. "Get the base commander on the line," Miller snapped, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Tell him it's a Code Alpha heritage issue. Then get me a car and a security detail. We are going to range 7, and we are going fast." Back on the sun-baked firing line, the command was given. "Shooters, you may commence firing when your target is ready." A series of sharp cracks echoed down the line as the other Marines began their strings of fire. Corporal Davies, eager to put on a show, sent 5 rounds downrange in quick succession. The electronic monitor above his lane showed a tight, respectable grouping in the center ring. He racked his bolt and glanced over at Lester's lane with a smug grin. The old man hadn't even fired yet. He was still lying there, perfectly still, as if he were part of the landscape. "Hey, Grandpa, You gonna shoot that thing or just take a nap? Davies called out, his voice loud and clear over the intermittent gunfire. Better hurry before the wind changes. Or before your hip gives out. It was a stunning breach of etiquette, a direct and insulting taunt during a live fire event. The gunnery sergeant spun around, his face turning a dark shade of red. Davies, mind your lane, that's your final warning. But Lester didn't seem to hear them. The world had shrunk to the small circle of light at the end of his vintage scope. The glass was old, but it was pristine German crystal, clearer and brighter than any of the mass-produced lenses in the modern scopes. He saw the target, not as a piece of paper, but as a problem to be solved. He felt the subtle shift of the wind against his cheek, calculated the drop, and let his breathing slow until the world seemed to slow with it. His finger rested on the trigger. It was then that a new sound began to intrude. A low rumble from behind them that grew steadily louder. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of powerful engines moving at speed. Heads began to turn. Down the long gravel access road, a procession of black command vehicles and military police cars was approaching, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. They didn't slow for the parking area. They drove right onto the grass behind the firing line, coming to a halt in a perfectly spaced, intimidating line. Their red and blue lights flashed in the bright sun, but their sirens remained silent, which was somehow more menacing. Doors opened in perfect, disciplined unison. Out stepped the base commander himself, a two-star general, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of grim purpose. He was followed by Colonel Miller and a phalanx of sergeants major, the highest-ranking enlisted men on the base. The effect was instantaneous. The shooting stopped. The chatter died. The entire range, filled with some of the deadliest marksmen in the world, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. A general didn't just drop by a firing range. An arrival like this meant one of two things, a catastrophe or the second coming. The gunnery sergeant, his face now pale, fumbled for his whistle and blew a sharp, piercing blast. "Cease fire. Cease fire. Unload and show clear," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a nervousness he couldn't conceal. The general ignored everyone. He strode past the slack-jawed Corporal Davies as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked past the gunnery sergeant. His eyes, like chips of blue ice, were locked on one person, the old man in the faded shooting jacket who was now slowly, and a little stiffly, pushing himself up from the ground. The general stopped 3 feet in front of Lester Newton. He stood for a moment, his gaze taking in the old man and the ancient rifle he held. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, he snapped the most immaculate salute of his long and distinguished career. His hand didn't waver. His posture was perfect. "Miss Newton," the general's voice boomed, carrying across the silent range with the full force of his command, "it is an honor to have you on our range, sir." Lester looked at the general, a flicker of surprise in his old eyes, and gave a slow, simple nod of acknowledgement. Colonel Miller stepped forward, holding a digital tablet. "Corporal Davies," he barked. Davies, who looked as if he might faint, jolted to attention. "You and your fire team, you will stand at attention until I tell you otherwise." They scrambled to comply, their faces a mixture of terror and utter confusion. The colonel looked down at his tablet, then back at the assembled Marines. "For the education of those who have forgotten the meaning of respect," he began, his voice cold and clear, "let me tell you who you are standing in the presence of. Lester Newton, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps 1965, service Republic of Vietnam, 1st Marine Division, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." He paused, letting the hallowed unit designation hang in the air. He fought at Khe Sanh, at Hue City, at places whose names are now etched into the walls of our chapels. He was awarded the Navy Cross for gallantry in action, and then he was awarded a second Navy Cross for gallantry in action. The colonel took a breath, and for his actions on Hill 881, where he single-handedly held off an enemy battalion for 36 hours, armed with little more than the rifle he holds in his hands today, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The smirks and whispers were gone, replaced by a wave of shock and profound, humbling awe. The young Marines looked at Lester, not as an old man but as a titan from their history books come to life. "And one more thing," Colonel Miller added, his eyes finding Davies's. "In 1988 at this very range, then Gunnery Sergeant Newton used that same rifle and that same museum-piece scope to set the 1000-yard single-shot course record, a record which for 35 years every Marine on this base, including you, Corporal, has tried and failed to break." The general finally lowered his salute and turned his glacial gaze upon Davies. His voice was not loud, but it was heavy, each word a hammer blow. "Corporal, this corporal is a house. It is a house built on the sacrifice of men like him. You are a guest in that house. You do not mock the architects. You mocked his rifle. That rifle has seen more combat than your entire company combined. You mocked his age. That age was earned in jungles you can't even imagine, fighting for the very freedom that gives you the right to wear that uniform. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You are relieved of your duties. You will report to the base sergeant major. Your new duty station is the base museum. You will spend every day for the next month cleaning the displays, and you will learn the story behind every weapon, every uniform, and every hero in that building. Is that understood? Yes, General. Davies choked out, his face white as a sheet. Lester Newton finally spoke. He stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on the general's starched sleeve. General, he said, his voice calm. The boy is young. We were all young once, full of fire and vinegar, eager to prove we belong. He turned his gaze to Davies, and there was no malice in it, only a deep, weary wisdom. Son, he said, this rifle, this scope, they aren't about the technology. It's about respect. Respect for your equipment, respect for your brothers and sisters in arms, and most of all, respect for yourself. A steady hand and a clear eye don't come from a factory. They come from here, he said, tapping his chest. And from here. He tapped his temple. It's the marksman, not the rifle. As his hand rested on the scope, another memory, sharp and clear, surfaced. A muddy foxhole, the air thick with humidity and fear. His spotter, Miguel, a kid from San Antonio who always had a joke ready. An enemy sniper had them pinned. Miguel used a helmet on a stick as a decoy. A shot rang out. The helmet flew. Miguel grinned. Got him, he whispered. A split second later, another shot. A ricochet from a rock whined past Lester's head and struck the scope of his rifle with a violent crack. The impact spun the rifle, saving his eye, maybe his life. Miguel, ever resourceful, pulled a tube of epoxy from his pack. A good luck scar, he'd said as he patched the deep gouge in the metal. The next day, Miguel was gone, a victim of a mortar strike. The scope wasn't just a piece of glass and metal. It was the last thing a brother had ever touched. It was a promise. The general, moved by Lester's words, simply nodded. He turned to the stunned range officer. Gunny, clear the firing line. Everyone off, except for Mr. Newton. The range was cleared in record time. The crowd of Marines, including a humbled and ashamed Davies, stood back in a silent, reverent semicircle. The general looked at Lester. Sir, he said softly, the line is yours. Lester gave another slow nod. He walked back to his mat and settled into his position as if he were alone. He didn't check the wind again. He didn't readjust his scope. He became one with the rifle, a seamless fusion of man and machine. He breathed in. He breathed out. The rifle cracked, a single sharp report that echoed across the silent valley. For a long moment, nothing happened. Everyone held their breath, their eyes fixed on the large digital monitor that displayed the target results. Then a number flashed on the screen. A perfect 10, a dead center bullseye, but it was more than that. The computer system, measuring the shot's position to 1/1000th of an inch, registered a grouping so precise it was almost a mathematical impossibility. The old record, set by a younger Lester Newton 35 years ago, flashed on the screen, and then beside it the new score appeared. He had broken his own unbreakable record. The silence broke. It wasn't polite applause, it was a roar. A deep, thunderous ovation of pure, unadulterated respect from hundreds of United States Marines for one of their own. The story of Lester Newton's return became an instant legend on the base. The incident was transformed into a mandatory training module for all units, a powerful lesson on heritage, humility, and the quiet valor of the generations that came before. Corporal Davies was indeed reassigned. The arrogance was stripped from him, replaced by a quiet diligence as he learned the stories etched into the brass plaques at the base museum. 1 month later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the museum was nearly empty. Davies, now a private first class, was carefully polishing the glass of a Vietnam War exhibit. The door creaked open, and Lester Newton walked in, wearing a simple polo shirt and slacks. Davies stiffened, his heart pounding. He expected a rebuke, a final word of condemnation, but Lester just smiled a kindly smile and walked over to the display case. "This is a good place," Lester said, his voice soft. "Lots of stories here." He pointed to a battle-worn rifle inside the case, a model identical to his own, had one just like it. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, two Marines from two different worlds, connected by the long, unbroken line of the Corps. Davies finally found his voice. "Sir," he said, turning to face the old man. His eyes were clear, his shame replaced by a hard-won respect. Lester Newton looked at the young Marine, truly looked at him, and clapped him firmly on the shoulder. "You're learning, son," he said. "That's all any of us can ever do. Keep learning." Lester turned and walked out, leaving the young man alone with the ghosts and the legends. Davies watched him go, then turned back to the glass. In his reflection, he no longer saw an arrogant hotshot. He saw a Marine who was finally beginning to understand the profound weight and honor of the uniform he wore. The heroes who walk among us often carry the heaviest stories with the quietest grace. If you were moved by Lester Newton's story of valor, show your support by liking this video, sharing it with a friend, and subscribing to Veteran Valor for more.